because I have a project called Payday. I was illegally fired at Politico on a Union Drive. I won a settlement and started my own publication.
Oh, look at that.
Like a little syndication service. We got
Sticking it to
syndication
Politico.
deals. We're just covering labor in the South.
All right.
I was living in Tennessee, now I live in Kentucky.
Oh, a lot of labor history there. A lot of it dark.
Especially with what's happening with right to work there now. Under attack.
Come a long way.
Yeah, get around. I was just in Southwest Virginia. And what's really interesting is the polls show you leading at almost 3-1. That's according to the Washington Post in Southwest Virginia. And a lot of people have said you've spent a lot of time there more than anything else. The one thing that seems to resonate in Southwest Virginia that's been really hard hit by poverty, by lack of jobs, by lack of opportunities, is the opposition to the pipeline there. I mean, pipelines and fracking, typically people see that as jobs, but this is actually propelling your campaign. And someone was telling me recently that you were at an event down there and you said you hadn't seen so many Trump's bumper stickers in a parking lot until you went to an anti-pipeline event. Well, what's happening? How are you expanding the base in Southwest Virginia?
Well, look, I think there are a couple of things that are very upsetting to people across the political spectrum, but certainly something upsetting to our libertarian brothers and sisters and others on the right. One has been the rise of monopolies in the last 25 years, and the electric utilities are a big part of that, and I'll come back to it. The second is been, and related to that, has essentially been the use of eminent domain creeping into corporate gain. Eminent domain is a very serious constitutional power. We need the government to have that power from time to time in order to be able to do things that are in the public interest. But as we've seen this blurring of a line between corporate interests and the public sector through campaign finance and other means, you see situations like the pipeline where they have not proved a public good here. And they want to spend $6.7 billion on 2 pipelines that they haven't even proved the need for, going over people's property, threatening people's trout streams where they fish, in order to make $150 million a year guaranteed, because in our perverse federal laws, there's a guaranteed return on investment for these pipeline expenditures. So we shouldn't be surprised when Dominion Power buys up the offshore wind rights, puts them on a shelf, and then says, look, we have no choice but to pursue this for baseload power. So I think people are upset about this, and this has really been a long time coming, as you know. From Teddy Roosevelt until the 80s, antitrust provisions in America had 2 basic pieces: keep it cheap and keep it small. In the Reagan years, we got rid of keep it small and said, as long as it's keeping it cheap, we don't care. And we've seen the exact result you would expect since then, which is a destruction of small, very cheap consumer products, obviously inflation in other sectors. And it's crushed not just the economies of small communities, but their sovereignty, their ability to control their own future. And the pipeline is both a metaphor and an example, I think, to them of outsiders, corporations, in collusion with government actors to be able to define their future.
When I hear you talking about monopolies here, I'm reminded of what my colleague William Greider wrote about the remaking of a new populist moment. You're obviously building a new kind of coalition in places like Southwest Virginia, rural activists, labor, environmentalists. What do you think the party, the left, the progressive movement needs to do in terms of coalition building to take back power?
So first, we're not building it. The communities are building it. I think in some cases we've been able to earn their trust and build alliances.
Important distinction.
But there are really people in the trenches that have been trying to make this case for a while. And the communities, when I spend time in Southwest Virginia, I used to represent Southside, which is different. Southside Virginia was the old textiles, furniture, and tobacco belt, not coal. But you go further out, you see a lot of the same economic challenges, but you're getting more into Appalachia and the coal areas. And people are looking for something new because the old way isn't working. And I think that's part of what Trump's appeal was, along with structural and overt racism. We can't whitewash that. But there were really these ways in which regions feel like they've been left behind. So when we talk about what it means to go from an economy of extraction to an economy of restoration, again, that's both literal and figurative in terms of what we can do in the communities. But I think one of the things, I was at an economic development forum down in Southwest with some folks, and this woman who's one of the top economic development experts there had a phrase that stuck with me about what they've sort of tried for the last 15 years. She said, we figured out that if we build it, they will not come, but if we grow it, we can harvest it. And what she meant is we need to get out of this mentality that we're We're one new corporation away from solving our economic development problems. Build an industrial park, give them lots of tax breaks, and it's like monocropping in agriculture, right? It's a very vulnerable thing. So what you want to do is not go in that direction. So it's asset-based development. How do you build on what the community already has? But I do find if you show up, listen, and then have something to say, you can make progress. So I learn a lot out there, too.
Yeah, people are saying you've made a decision very early on to spend a lot of time down there. Why is that?
So there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of potential. And I think as progressives, if we claim to care about human suffering and about fairness and justice, when we have 3 Virginians dying every day of the opioid epidemic, are we really addressing that with the moral urgency it deserves? When we have coal miners down there we may not agree with on the climate issues, but they believe that the coal companies are going to declare bankruptcy and tear up 40 years of lifetime benefits that they've earned, are we there to try to be a counterforce to that corporate power? Are we sitting down and talking to people about the cultural heritage that we can draw on, everything from quilting to folk music to you name it from that area?
It's a big tourism region.
It is, and it can be even bigger.
Especially if they had rail there.
Exactly. And so where can we find these win-wins? As I think my background is not really in politics. I've actually been a peace negotiator over in West Africa and Afghanistan, Central Africa. And one of the things you learn as a peace negotiator is to show up and listen to both sides. And one of the things that gives me hope right now about building this Bobby Kennedy-style coalition is when I spend time in communities of color, particularly in urban areas, I hear a lot about wanting to reduce poverty, about what happened to the trade schools and the apprenticeship programs, why aren't we building and making things anymore, and we can't afford this ridiculous criminal justice system. We need to start treating addiction as a health crisis, not a crime. Then you go out to rural Virginia, and you hear, lo and behold, we need to build and make things again. We need the trade schools and apprenticeship programs. How are we going to address poverty and poverty wages? Why do the corporations have too much power? And even criminal justice reform, which is different than growing up. Growing up, there's no question the sort of law and order dystopic language was very appealing there. But I think people are beyond that.
It's impressive hearing you speak, because most politicians don't speak about economy of extraction versus economy of restoration. You're talking heavily about building one thing that gets to me when I talk to people is that you're really talking about a new vision, free community college, investing in clean energy, building an economy that's bottom up for folks. How much has this resonate with folks, this idea? Because people are so used to politicians that get up and they don't give these long speeches of big visions. They rattle off a few talking points. How much do you think this resonates with people? You bring up Bobby Kennedy. I mean, do you think people see that comparison?
Oh, they shouldn't see the comparison to me. I'm no Bobby Kennedy, but I think that it's the moment. I think that people... The basic disconnect right now, I think, is between leaders in both parties who are comfortable enough that they essentially think the system is working and we need to tweak it around the edges. And I think when you spend time outside of those circles, what you hear is the tectonics themselves are shifting in very scary ways. And you have to show up and listen to hear it, because it's building, it's automation coming in as the next great disruptor, right? Globalization is not it's not outsourcing that's destroying those jobs today. Those jobs are ceasing to exist, right? Technology is taking that out. We need to have those conversations. So people really appreciate it. One of the things I kind of joke about this in politics, but it's really true, is, particularly when I'm up in Northern Virginia, to be honest, people always say, oh, well, Tom, you sound too smart. You sound like a think tank. You need a bumper sticker for those people. And it's funny because nobody ever, wants their own message reduced to a bumper sticker. They want a 60-minute conversation with me, but they think other people want this distillation. I think the amount of distrust and cynicism that is out there can only be worn down by showing up and showing up and showing up again. And, again, we're only at the front end of this. I mean, you gave some nice statistics about how we're doing. That's with Democrats, and those are with primary voters in Southwest Virginia. Now I'm really proud of how we're doing, but we have a lot of work to do to reach out beyond. Now, I think we have a good message. We're going to be up against a Republican in Ed Gillespie that is everything Trump voters hate about the corporate Republican Party. So I think we're going to have a really kind of a once-in-a-generation opportunity by having the kind of more pragmatic populist campaign we're running against such a corporate, disastrous candidate on the right, that we can make some of those cases. But it's not going to happen in a single election cycle. But I think we have to stand bolder. We have to fight. And I think that's what we started to do in the 5th District of Virginia when we were 36% behind and found a way to win.
You did a pretty bold stand for someone running for governor of Virginia. You came out against right to work, not just out against it, but for its repeal. How important is labor in the South and rebuilding the labor movement in the South to building a new progressive vision?
It was important everywhere. My great-grandfather was a labor organizer. He was a glassblower union president, got blacklisted, knew Gompers. This is all family lore. I assume, most of it's been verified out. When you think about, it was interesting. I was down at Coal Country, and we were having a debate about whether the coal jobs were going to come back or not under Pruitt and Trump. And they had a back and forth, and this guy came out, and he'd worked for the coal companies for 30 years. And he said, let's face it, if they could still pay us $2 a day, they'd still be paying us $2 a day. The only reason we have anything from those companies is not because of the largesse of the companies, but because we demanded it through some very, very bloody union strikes back in the day. I think this is part of a broader challenge that we face of unwiring or unwiring in our own brains how much we've internalized the false myth of trickle-down economics. Because if you start with trickle-down economics, the idea is growth comes from huge tax cuts to the richest companies and richest people. Allow them to consolidate as much wealth as possible, deregulate, lower tax rates, and that's a race to the bottom. And once you buy that logic, then raising the minimum wage doesn't make sense because it'll destroy jobs. Raising taxes to invest in education and infrastructure doesn't make sense because you're going to kill business. And the only problem with the trickle-down theory is data and evidence. If you look over the last 30 years, it doesn't create growth. It actually crushes the middle class. It creates consolidation at the top, which has a suffocating effect on growth. Unions are the same thing. We've been told a myth that these are somehow something that makes us less competitive and is anti-growth. The reality is when workers actually have a say, then there's more disposable income for the working middle class. And when that happens, people have money to spend, and lo and behold, we have more local growth.
Let me ask you a question. You want to repeal right to work. Currently, there's a law on the book in Virginia that public employees don't have the right to collectively bargain. Would you be in favor of giving public employees the right to collectively bargain in Virginia?
Well, we've been looking at opportunities there. I mean, obviously, it's going to be tough for the legislature. There's the confer and
meet and confer,
and we've had some of them able to do that and not others. Certainly, it's something where we want to be able to make sure. I mean, in my mind, people should have a right to collectively bargain, and I think we don't have very strong unions in Virginia outside of a very limited number of sectors, and certainly not even confer. Sorry.
Meet and confer.
Meet and confer.
Well, it's a lot easier to say collective bargaining. Let's hope they get that someday. Let me ask you another question. Your coalition of supporters is interesting in that, there's a lot of people that want to refight the primary, and you've been able to bring in Hillary and Bernie supporters together behind you. Do you think this could be a model for how people can move forward and sort of put that primary behind us?
I mean, we'd love to. We like to think of ourselves as the greatest hits album. When people talk about this being a Hillary and Bernie race, I mean, I think it doesn't give enough credit to either one of them.
So you're like picking out the best tracks.
Yeah, you want the best tracks, right? And so when I think about it, what Warren and Sanders have tapped into is an understanding of how corrupt and broken the system is, how radical inequality has become, and that's really touched a nerve because so few people have spoken to it in that way, and we want to speak to that. I think Hillary Clinton doesn't get enough credit, both as an executive manager. I think the way she ran the State Department was exceptional. The Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review that I ran for President Obama was something she had created. Her policy depth and knowledge on these things, even her focus on community college and trade school, I think. So there's so much good there. And then from Barack Obama, who I got elected with in 2008, his ability to stay focused on hope and the aspirational. I think it's in the sense that we do have an underlying common humanity. And I think as progressives, we identify a lot in coalition politics, and I do that, and it's important. But I think part of what he was able to do, and certainly they undermined his ability to do it at every turn, was to talk about a sense of common aspiration. So, I'm not claiming to be any of those things. I can aspire to try to draw on those things. And I think, ultimately people are just looking forward. And I think that there's a lot of lazy journalism out there and some of it's
they're pretty lazy
clickbait journalism.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of that. You don't pay people well, and they're going to do this
Um,
clickbait.
It's much easier than actually digging into our tax reform plans and realizing that we've actually paid for everything we've proposed. We actually have a community college plan that's truly transformative and not a last dollar plan. We've really talked about racial justice issues in a way that, frankly, most journalists are absolutely terrified to talk about.
I saw that your literature in Southwest Virginia was emphasizing that you're a candidate against hate. And people were saying they were really impressed that, because typically local government officials in Roanoke don't go to Northwest Roanoke, and you were going to Northwest Roanoke.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that if there's something, one of the things I took away from the time in Congress was that people don't have to agree with you all the time. In fact, they'll often respect you for when you're willing to speak to a disagreement on that. And I think it's important for us right now, and it's tricky to do, particularly without individual conversation, to be able to say that Trump ran a racist campaign. He is playing in racial demagogue politics, but that does not mean every Trump voter was motivated by race. And being able to try to keep multiple lines of conversation open is difficult because we want to reduce that down. So I think there are many reasons for people in rural Virginia to feel like both parties left them behind, and wanting to, frankly, give a middle finger to both parties by voting for Trump. Now, it's not to forgive that; it's just to try to understand the basis for that. So we go forward, but I think that it's important for Democrats to remember there was a poll in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago that said most Americans think Democrats only care about rich people, and that's shocking to most Democrats because we know we are the party that's actually standing up for the poor and the struggling and the vulnerable, and I'm proud to be a Democrat. But we have to understand that we win those people over not by trying to sound like Republicans, but by actually sounding like genuine progressives from drawing on the true greatest hits, going back to the Roosevelts and the Kings and others.
One last question. A win here, people forget that so much of the New Deal happened because of Southern organizing. Particularly anti-monopoly organizing. If you look at the history of the TVA, you think a win here could send a message to other Democrats in the South about what kind of campaigns they want to run?
Look, what do they say? Victory is 1,000 parents and defeat is an orphan. So if we get through June 13th, I do think there will be a lot to learn from that. And if we get through November, there'll be a lot to learn from that. John Podesta called this the blueprint for the future of the Democratic Party. But people will look at a loss differently. And I think we have 13 days to pull this off. And I do think there will be some political leaders who look at that and say, oh, the answer is to be bolder. The answer is to actually stand strong for the issues in our coalition while expanding. And Virginia is a classic swing state now, and it happens to be one close enough to the D.C. media market that some journalists feel like they can drive an hour.
I drove from Louisville.
Right. No, I know you were coming the opposite direction. So look, I think there is a lot to be said from that, and I think again, people. There's a lot of echo effect in politics. So we would be really, really excited. We're very proud of the campaign we've run. Frankly, there are a lot of issues now that have been accepted or mainstreamed in the Virginia Democratic Party that were untouchable before. And we think we're changing the sense of what's possible. But in my experience, and I'll just end on this, I grew up being very skeptical of politics and very admiring of movements. I think movements change the world and politicians show up to take the credit and cut the ribbon. But I've kind of grown over time to see it as more of a partnership. Movements have to change our sense of what's possible. Politicians have to work within the sense of what's possible. But bold politicians can take a more aggressive play on what's possible in conjunction with movements that are bolder about how to move things. And that's how change happens. Immigration reform or immigrant rights was untouchable for Democrats for a number of years because it was seen as a losing issue in many areas. It was organizers who changed that by going out and changing the politics of the issue. I think at its height, labor has done that. I don't know what the next generation of organizing looks like in Virginia, or across the South. What I can tell you is that those struggles have rarely been simple and smooth. Dr. King says, power is never given up by the powerful, it's demanded by the oppressed. And so I think we're going to see some very dynamic developments in communities and states and across the country in the coming years. We think this is a great opportunity where we can kind of have the best of both worlds, be boldly progressive and populist while still having partly because of my background, a foot in the establishment and a foot in that progressive change, and hopefully be an ally to those out there that are trying to push the envelope on a more fair and just economy.
Well, thanks for sitting down and talking
Thank you
with us.
very much.